little bit, maybe. Good morning. I've thought about changing that way at times of greeting you all when I come up to preach, but there's something so nice about it. I wouldn't want it to change, but I thought I'd play a little bit with inflection, because it's something I've been thinking a fair amount about recently. I was struck once again by the problem that we have when reading something, that this is something that we miss. And we sometimes don't notice it. The more we read, the better we get at putting inflection into passages that need it, particularly people speaking. And so sometimes we can miss that this is something that isn't there when we're reading. It's something we guess at. And inflection is so important. If you've ever heard a sentence said with the wrong inflection, it can be very distracting and confusing at times what someone means. And so it's an important part of how we communicate with one another, but it's lost when we're just reading words. This is something we find with emails. If you've ever sat down and read an email and thought, why is this person so angry with me? What's happened? It's because there's no inflection. There's no ability for you to know what they're actually thinking and how they meant what they've said. You're guessing, you're putting your own ideas on it, and it's important when we do that, particularly in novels, to bring them to life, to actually understand what is it that this person means, how are they communicating, how do they seem to be feeling. And so, yeah, it's a really important part of speech. And I've entitled this sermon, Listen. Very simply, listen. It's an important word in Hebrew culture and Hebrew thought, and it appears in this passage. And it's a sort of a really incredibly deep and yet so simple word. And we have even the knowledge of this prayer that exists, that for the Hebrew people it's called Shema. It means hear or listen. And so we have this important word appear and this important event going on. We have to try and figure out what's going on here and try to put some inflection into it to figure out and play with this idea to figure out what's going on. As we've discussed many times, that the meaning is found in the context. And with this bit of context missing, we do have to play with it to understand what's really going on in many passages, but this one in particular, I think, when we hear God speak, it's particularly important. So, Peter, if you want to come and do our reading. Some things to pay attention to note these important things that are somewhat missed, that we have to be aware of, that they bring life to the passages as we read them.
So we're reading from Luke chapter 9. We're beginning at verse 28. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendour, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfilment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, and when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He didn't know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen.
Thank you. As we see, that word appears, and it's a part of a broader idea of specifically what to listen to. Listen to him. And there are so many ways we can read such a thing, and so many different ways, and it's something that we have to play with a little bit. And as we do, we can sort of start to guess at what might have been meant at a deeper level with these seemingly simple words. So there's a lot going on as this story unfolds. We have Luke saying that Jesus' face changes, and that's a big deal. That's how we recognize one another. That's how we know who we're talking to. And so for his face to change is a big thing. It's a thing of like his identity was different. Recognizable entirely, because they instantly recognize who he is, but this is significant. And so they have Jesus change in appearance, and Moses and Elijah appear with him, and seemingly it's around about this time that Peter, John and James wake up. And suddenly, not only is the person that they knew and the person that they love and have been following for some time now not exactly the same, he's with 2 other people whom they seem to recognize quite quickly as these people who haven't been on the earth for quite some time. And so there's all of this going on. It's absolutely staggering to think you wake up from a nap and there's one of your best friends and he looks almost ghostly, but it's amazing. It's not scary. Seemingly they're not afraid. They're particularly astounded. It seems like a joyous thing for them, but they're very taken aback. And we have the opportunity to step back hearing the story later, and we recognize, these people are representative of something. We see Moses, he represents the law. That makes sense. He's sometimes called the law of Moses. It makes sense that if he's there, that's what's going on. And Elijah's there, and he represents the prophets, quite rightly. A rather amazing prophet, if you spent any time reading about him. And but for them, this is all very sudden. But we've got the opportunity to sit back and to reflect on it and realize that what's going on here is that Moses and Elijah are there, and they're talking to Jesus about what he's going to do, because this whole event is sort of a foreshadowing idea. It's a thing for them to reflect on later that will tell them this is who Jesus was going to be. He was the one who would fulfill the law and the prophets, and who in that moment was the fulfillment at the same time. It's this idea of now and not yet. He hasn't done what needs to be done, but because he is the chosen one, he will. And then God speaks, the Father. A cloud descends around them, and the Father seemingly responds to Peter, which is particularly interesting. It's almost as if perhaps that wouldn't have happened if Peter had just kept his mouth shut. It's possible that this wouldn't have needed to happen. The event would have unfolded as it did, but without this particular ending. They would have gone down the mountain and they would have continued on with what was happening. But God seems to respond particularly to what Peter is saying. There is a sense in which the Father seems to be saying, stop worrying so much. Stop running around trying to come up with an answer for something to do. Listen to Jesus. Listen to him. Really pay attention, because things are changing. Not just his appearance, that's a sign of something so much greater. There is so much more. And what we see is that Peter wants to build a tabernacle. And the thing about that is that's the right thing to do, in a way. If we think about it, we can see who Peter is. We know that he's a Jew. He knows the law. He's very familiar. He understands. He's thinking like a Jew. He has this history, and it's very well established in his thinking. And so he sees heavenly figures come down, and it says the cloud descends, so it's entirely possible that that cloud was there before. And so we have all of these ideas of the presence of God. As a Jew, what do you do with the presence of God? You build it a dwelling place. That's the right thing to do. In your religious thinking, this makes sense. This is the right action. But things are different here. And God has to tell him that's not how things work. It's not the right response. And we have to be fairly careful of this tendency too. In our religious thinking, our thinking about the way the world works, we can tend to want to put God in his right place. We think this is how you work, and we understand that, and now that's how we expect you to always work. But that's the thing. God's the one who is without limitation. It's we who have limitations. And so, as much as we can't entirely expect the ways God might work, we have to be careful of not putting him where we think he belongs. This is a strange move as well, because we've already had the transition from the tabernacle to the temple. It's a very weird idea, I think, for Peter to say, let's go back to this transient, temporary dwelling place for God, when that's all associated with life in the desert and moving through the promised land and the struggles they had to go through to get the promised land, not entirely in the ideal way, but they managed to do it. They no longer had to travel from place to place, putting up a tabernacle so that God dwelt, and it was set up in the right way, but it was temporary, and so they took it down, they moved it, they put it back up again. They took it down, they moved it, they put it back up again. Continuing this cycle, they were finally able to stop. When they had the promised land, they were able to establish this is where God will dwell with his people. And the more permanent that is, the better. In their thinking, if God dwells with us here permanently, what a great and amazing thing. And God is quite clear that as long as they follow his ways, that's the way it's supposed to go. We know it doesn't quite go that way, but this is all good thinking, and Peter seems to revert in that thinking and decide that the tabernacle is the right way to go here. And so it's a very strange move. And the thing about the temple is that it's so deeply ingrained in their thinking, because when Solomon dedicates the temple, he prays something along the lines of, hear your people and hear me when we pray in this direction. when we pray toward this place, when we pray toward Jerusalem, if you're further away, it's harder to point directly at the temple, but you pray toward Jerusalem. That's where the presence of God is in their thinking. And so clearly we see here Peter suddenly realizing the presence of God is here. We're supposed to do something about that, and yet they've had the presence of God with them for some time, and there's this very confusing thinking going on. It's very hard for Peter to understand, but as I said, it's not entirely surprising. There is so much going on all at once in this event. But it's almost as if in what the Father is saying, in everything that's happened, God is saying, stop building me dwelling places. Which in their thinking is unthinkable. God needs a place to dwell. How else can he be with us? But it seems like this idea is coming through. Stop trying to limit God. We're working in a different way. Pay attention. As I said, God seems to be saying, pay attention to what Jesus is doing. There's something new about this and something amazing about what the implications of this are. That the presence of God is right here with you and doesn't need to be given a dwelling place is a big deal. That even the temple and the tabernacle are being fulfilled. Their role in the religious ways of life are being fulfilled along with the law and the prophets. All of these things, their purposes, everything that they were for is being fulfilled. Everything the law requires, the sacrifice, the ideas of how you get in right relationship with God, everything that comes into the law is in Jesus, which is why what we see is kind of this call from Jesus to behave and think differently. Because you no longer need to be subject to the law as such. And then we see that he is completely in accord with everything that the prophets foretold. That there would be this suffering servant who would come down, who would be with his people and would show us a new way of life, and that it would be unlike anything we'd known before, that Emmanuel would come. But Emmanuel came and had no dwelling place. It's interesting that Jesus displays that, but even says at one point, I have nowhere to lay my head, I have no home, I have nowhere to be. I have nowhere that I dwell. In essence, saying, I dwell in a different way. God no longer dwells apart. He no longer dwells over there. Which means we can dwell with God in this new way. As we've gone through 1 Kings in Cab, Kappa and Bible, I noticed that the temple is an entirely human idea. God accepts it and seems very pleased with this idea, but the significance of that, I think, is undervalued, that we see that this is something that David comes up with and God says, yes, this is good, your son will do that. And then Solomon seems to design this building and bring it to life. We see a echoing of some of the design of the tabernacle, but we see him go further with decorations and additions to this temple that he makes. And so it's not entirely clear that it was something we needed. It was not entirely clear that it's something God needed. And this place, well, this is our temple. This is the place, we call it the house of God. Therefore, we must think in some way that this is where God dwells. But that raises the question, where is the presence of God? Do we truly believe that it is here, in other church buildings, or somewhere else? Do we believe that as Jesus died and rose again, things changed forever, and that was prophesied and foreshadowed at this event of the Transfiguration? That this event tells us that everything we needed was being fulfilled. That we would be changed forever. That as Christ came, so the Spirit's coming and being poured out on all people, as Joel prophesied, tells us that everything we needed to be in proper relationship with God in this new and unbelievable way, under this new covenant, was fulfilled. I feel and have felt the presence of God here for a long time. It's been somewhere that I've recognized the presence of God and felt like he's really at work in this place, amongst us. I've experienced it from many of you at times, hearing things and seeing what you're doing, and recognizing that God's at work in you, and God can really be at work in me in the same way if I give myself to that. Tabor became a similar place. It was a place of learning and growing in a different way, but it was so similar. More intense at times. And what I sort of came to realize out of that experience more and more, and really deeply understand, was that God wasn't here. That we were together. That people of God gathered wherever we gathered. And when we came to focus and really talk about what it meant to follow Jesus and try to work that out in our lives, that's when I experienced God, because we were participating in this thing of recognizing that God was with us. That it's really about the Spirit, the Christ Spirit, this idea that Jesus dwells with us always because the Spirit came in this way we can't really understand, but we know is true. Solomon's prayer that I talked about just before begins with something along the lines of, can God really dwell on earth? Is this really possible? Heaven, the infinite, abundant heavens, can't contain God. What is this temple that I have built? Even how can this pretend to be enough to contain or to be a place where God can dwell? But the thing is, yes. Yes, absolutely. Not only can God dwell with us, he will. And in the way that he does, change everything. He comes to us like us. We actually meet God as a human being, and he teaches us what it means to live in relationship as a human being to God. He's really on earth and remains with us, just in a different way, in an unbelievably complex and not even really understandable way, but we know that he is with us. And by this event, we know that it's in a different way. But we have to think differently. We have to change the way we approach this. What I realized by these different places that I experienced God, and the fact that they had so much in common in my experience, and yet nothing in common in what they are, I began to see that we don't really need a place to dwell with God. And God doesn't really need a place to dwell. It's more that we needed and always need a place to be reminded that God dwells with us always. It can be a daunting thought. And it can be very easy, particularly to live this way of thinking that God is over there somewhere. And we live our lives, and when we come back here, we remember that God exists and cares about us and loves us, and leave again. This is not the way God works. He changed everything by coming down to our level, and Peter doesn't get it. He tries to build a dwelling place so that God would be there and properly set up, that Moses and Elijah and Jesus would all have their proper place over there. And Solomon doesn't meet Jesus. He doesn't really get the reality that God can and will dwell with his people. That Emmanuel, God with us, who does not have a dwelling place, comes down so that he can dwell with us always. He's the fulfillment of everything we needed in order for this to be possible. It's something we couldn't do and couldn't happen unless he came and did these things, unless he fulfilled all the requirements of the law and everything the prophets had foretold. It's a particularly daunting thought because the potential for vulnerability increases when God's with us all the time. It doesn't really change the way we interact with him when we pay attention to him, but ideally, and in essence, what Jesus attempts to do is to say, you can recognize my presence with you whenever you want, and ideally, always. That I participate with you in everything. This requires a vastly different way of thinking to what we're used to a lot of the time. We get set on a task and we think to ourselves, now that's done, what am I doing next? And we never take the time to recognize and thank God for being with us in the midst of that. The more you do something like that, the more you realize you don't have to intentionally do it. The more the presence of God permeates your entire life. You recognize God in all things and see him as deeply invested in your life, and therefore you start to see him working in the lives of others more clearly. When we gather here together, it is really an opportunity to focus on God, to focus on that presence. As I said, this is a place where we can be reminded that God dwells with us always in this special, unbelievable way. And we come here to recognize this and do these things that unite us as the people of God and help us to orient ourselves toward God and remember who we are. It's also an opportunity to listen. To listen to him. And that again is a very vulnerable thing, because we never know quite what God will say if we really listen. We don't know what we'll say to ourselves if we really listen. The Spirit came and confirmed that Jesus dwells with us in this way. And so I wonder, and I want to give you a little bit of time to consider this, because I think it's particularly important. Have we, or perhaps how, have we limited God with the way we think about the world, the way we think God works, with the way that we imagine things play out and how we determine God's proper place in things? Have we made it so that he can't work in us? Have we decided that he can't work in other people? Maybe he works in some and not in others. Have we excluded God in ourselves, in our lives, in ways that we keep areas to ourselves? These parts belong to us, and God can participate in a certain amount of time or certain areas, or perhaps even certain areas at certain times. Where do you see God? I'm going to give you a short amount of time to consider this. How do you see the presence of God? How have you limited or excluded God? How do you see the presence of God? Where do you see him at work? How are you limiting what you believe? How are you limiting what he is capable of because you refuse to let him work as he wills? Let the Spirit blow where it wills. How are you hiding parts of yourself, perhaps from yourself? It is a rather terrifying idea to be vulnerable before God, and yet it is the one thing that makes us most safe. The God who judges is merciful and kind. He will not condemn us because he came to dwell with us. He came to show us love and presence in ways we couldn't have imagined were possible. Pray with me. Lord, thank you that you hear us. That when we speak, you listen whichever direction we are facing, wherever we are going. But you call us back to you. Help us to listen, to be attentive to your voice and your presence with us. Help us to dwell with you, to invite you in to every aspect of our lives, to invite you to work in ways we do not expect, and to watch you with surprise and delight. Help us to share all of ourselves, deepest parts, and every aspect of our lives, all that we do with you, recognizing your presence always. Lead us on. Amen. I chose this song, We Have a Maker, He Knows Our Name, because it speaks of how the Father is deeply invested in us. Always. Whatever is happening for us, He is with us. His presence comes to be with us, and the Spirit remains with us because of His abundant love and care. He came